This is Loopmancer. So now is the time of year, of course, where we're going to start seeing some pretty large releases happening again. So before we get to all of that, I wanted to take a look at a couple of smaller games, a couple of things that I'm not really hearing people talk about all that much, and this game is one of those. Loopmancer is an action platformer that's using the whole roguelite idea in kind of an interesting way. The whole idea is that you are a detective in a cyberpunk city, and every time you die, you wake up back on the morning of when you started your case. However, you remember everything, so all of the evidence you've gathered for your case so far, all of the choices that you made the last time and all that stuff stays in your mind. So each time you die and restart the loop, you are using what you learned on the last loop to improve each one progressively until you can make the best sequence of decisions possible and actually solve the case, which is a really interesting idea, and I don't think I've ever actually seen anyone use the roguelite mechanics in this way before. The setting is the first thing to talk about because it's also kind of unusual. It is a cyberpunk setting, but it's sort of role reverse from how a normal cyberpunk setting usually works, right? Because in like cyberpunk fiction, generally speaking, it is a large western super city with some eastern influences. Like you'll see a lot of Japanese technology companies and things like that representing how they own like half of the world. But Loopmancer setting is exactly the opposite of that. It is an eastern city with a lot of eastern architecture and a very deliberately Asian setting, but with Western influences instead. So it's just a neat sort of idea because when you see a cyberpunk setting, you're used to kind of how that's supposed to go, how that generally looks. And it's cool to see a game sort of flip that on its head and do it the opposite way as it normally would be, but still make it very clearly cyberpunk. And one of the biggest standouts of this game is actually its atmosphere, the atmosphere that that sort of unique cyberpunk setting creates. If you look at the backgrounds in this game, they're all really, really detailed. The actual art, the environment art in this game is gorgeous. All of the areas, they look really cool, and they have a tremendous amount of detail. I was impressed with every single level at how they managed to cram so much visual detail into the backgrounds. From the creepy village in the forest that has a really heavily forested background and a lot of like dilapidated buildings and eventually leads to a sort of Resident Evil underground biotech base, to the absolutely massive and really beautiful hotel that you go to that is several floors large and has an entire cyberpunk cityscape in the background complete with like dancing holograms and giant mechs and all sorts of cool stuff like that going on in the background. The overall environment detail in this game is probably its biggest standout point. It's just really, really detailed, and it's clear they've put a lot of love and effort into establishing a setting, into making the cyberpunk atmosphere actually matter more than just a sort of skin-deep level. It actually matters throughout the whole game, and it completely encompasses all of the visual design. Even at the very beginning, when you first start, you start in one of those classic sort of Spartan cyberpunk fancy apartments that a lot of the main characters always get, and it feels really atmospheric. It's raining on the background, the glass is getting all wet and shows the weather, and it all just feels really cohesive. It's genuinely impressive how much detail they've managed to put into all of these areas. And the other standout feature would definitely be the combat. The name of the game in this case is very much variety. There's a lot of weapon variety and enemy variety in the game that really spices it up a lot because it makes the runs feel very different. I have often said in the past that a good roguelite kind of lives or dies on its combat variety, and that's definitely the case here, and the combat variety is extremely good. There are like over 100 different weapons for you to find, a lot of which have very well done animations and very chunky melee combat, as well as being able to mix in some other stuff like grenades, guns, special powers like shooting lightning out of your hands, and various augmentations like that all fit well within a cyberpunk setting. And of course it all also matters what you're using it on, and there's quite a lot of enemy variety. There's just your basic like gang member grunts that you'll be facing at first, but they'll quickly give way to more advanced things, including like actual machines like robots and exoskeletons that people pilot, to expert military personnel, bionic ninjas, crazy mutants, and some other cool stuff like that. You can take one melee weapon, one gun, one piece of gear, which is usually a grenade or a deployable drone or something like that, and one augment, like for instance the aforementioned lightning, but also fire, ice, and earth powers. You have a basic melee combo that actually changes quite a bit with the weapon that you select, and there are a lot of weapons from katanas, baseball bats, clubs, sickles, all sorts of things. And as you build up melee combos, you'll eventually unlock something called an overkill. Every weapon has its own amount of combo that it needs to reach, and you can actually upgrade weapons to reduce this amount. And once you've stored up an overkill, you can click the sticks in at the same time. For something like a katana, it is a dashing slice. For something like a hammer, it's actually like a forward whirlwind, and some other things like that. They're just very powerful attacks that tend to go through several enemies at once, and are really good combo finishers. In the middle of your combos, you can also fit in some other stuff, like pressing Y to shoot whatever ranged weapon that you have equipped. And these can range from SMGs to various kinds of pistols, energy weapons, lightning shotguns, all sorts of cool stuff like that, and oftentimes a good combo mixes in these ranged attacks at moments where the enemy is the most vulnerable to sort of do the most damage possible. You've also got, of course, that deployable piece of gear that is usually something like a grenade or a deployable drone, and these tend to be very powerful, but you can only hold a very limited number of them at a time, and they are also sort of cancelable, so you can use them in the middle of melee combos as well for huge damage. And then of course you have your augmentation, so in the middle of a combo you can just lash out with lightning or throw fireballs or other cool stuff like that. So the combat system is quite varied and does feel pretty good. There's a good amount of hit slowdown when you actually do melee combo hits and stuff, so it feels weighty and impactful, and the enemies do tend to react quite well, and it helps that the animations, the melee attacking animations and things in this game, are actually quite good. The animations for both you and the enemies are pretty detailed and look nice, so that sort of fluidity helps the combat flow well. In between levels, you can also go back to the main detective building, and you can actually upgrade the weapons that you have equipped at any time. You get money just from killing enemies and from finding it in various breakable objects around the levels and stuff, and one of the things you can spend this money on are upgrades. So every weapon, melee weapon, range weapon, all that stuff can have things like their damage upgraded, their cooldown upgraded, how much spare ammo for it you can hold, and all sorts of things like that. So when you find a combination of weapons and skills that you really like, you can invest some of your money into making them even stronger. You can also find another resource called cores. You generally get these from big events like boss battles and things, and these are actually spent at the beginning of a loop after you die, and these are your sort of meta currency upgrade items. So you can use them for stuff like upgrading how much maximum health you have, and unlocking extra things like the ability to parry, and other character features that will just make your next loop a little bit easier. The way the actual game structure itself works is a little bit different. You'll start by going into the detective building and actually getting on the case that defines the entire game, and then each level is a new step in the case based on what you've found so far and what you think you should be doing. At several points in the story, you'll actually get a choice as to whether you want to go to place A or place B, and part of the loop system is to figure out which one of these leads to what and which ones you should do in which order by doing them across multiple loops and figuring out the most optimal way to gather the evidence that you need. It's a really genuinely pretty interesting way to do things because it uses the roguelite die and start over mechanics in a way that actually improves the loop of the game by allowing you to actually remember what happened last time and factor that into what you're going to do this time and actually change the outcome. For instance, about midway through, there's an important choice where your wife gets kidnapped and you're going to go and try and save her, but at the same time, a very important reporter is being held hostage and you also need to go and save her because she has a lot of the evidence that you need, but you can only choose one. So it's set up in a way that's sort of mutually exclusive, right? Either you go to save your wife or you go to save this reporter and help your case, and you don't exactly know what the consequences of this choice are immediately going to be, and that's the whole point of the loop system, is to make these choices multiple different ways each time and figure out which one works out best. And it turns out, if you choose to save the reporter instead, you will actually get a timer, and if you manage to complete that mission in just the right amount of time, which is pretty hard because it has a boss fight at the end, so you have to be really quick, but if you manage it, you can actually save your wife as well, and then get both of them. And you might not know this at first on your very first loop through, but that's sort of the whole point. It's to give you these choices and then to make you sort of try each one and then understand which order is best. And the narrative will eventually culminate in revealing the big bad and you using all of your evidence and stuff to connect it all together and then go and actually face him yourself. There are also a couple of other kind of interesting game mechanics that are mixed in there, like for instance you have a sort of grappling hook that allows you to get around the areas in pretty fun ways. Even though it's a 2D game, the grappling hook does add a lot of verticality to the areas. There's also these checkpoint-like systems you can find that can heal you when you find them, and the interesting thing about these is if you find enough of them you actually get an extra life, and you're allowed to actually die once and then come back without restarting the loop. There are also these terminals that you can invest money in to unlock new weapons and gear, and these terminals will remember how much money you put in, so every loop that you encounter them you can invest more and more until you finally unlock that gear. And there's also some hidden shops around the place that allow you to change out your gear based on the stuff that you have unlocked. So the game very much encourages exploration, and each of the levels is actually very large to accommodate this and tends to have some little hidden nooks here and there, some extra shops and extra checkpoint machines you can find and some other stuff like that, as well as various collectibles that will unlock more cores if you collect a bunch of them and go back to your apartment. So the game definitely does give you a lot of rewards for exploration, and it makes its levels actually large and detailed enough to be worth exploring. So overall, it's a really neat mixture actually that uses its roguelite mechanics in a way that I've never seen before and has really satisfying combat with a ton of variety to keep it interesting. I do have one problem with it, however. It's not a game-ruining problem, but it is an overarching problem that makes it feel kind of strange, and that's that the difficulty in this game is really weird. So, you know how most games have a difficulty curve, right? They start out easy and then they progressively get more and more difficult as you get towards the end. That's generally how it works. Some games have more of a difficulty wall where they just start out super hard, and once you get over that hump, you sort of get used to it and it becomes normal. Well, this game has sort of like a difficulty runway. It's completely flat for a really, really long time, and then suddenly you hit a brick wall at the very end. The first like 6 levels of this game are really easy. You are almost never threatened at all. You basically have to try to lose oftentimes because things just don't do very much damage to you and there aren't a ton of enemies to threaten you. Even the boss fights are really not that difficult. To put it into perspective, on my very first loop, I managed to get to the very end of the game. As in, my first loop with no upgrades, no meta progression, no nothing. Just my very first try, I actually made it to the very end. However, once you get to that 7th level, suddenly everything crashes down really hard and becomes super difficult because you have the biggest amount of enemy variety in a single level of any level in the game. Suddenly there's a ton of enemies everywhere and they actually do a lot of damage to you, unlike the rest of the enemies in the game. So the difficulty feels really strange. It feels like a complete cakewalk for the first like 3/4 of the game, and then the very end is just super difficult all of a sudden. So it feels really weird to have the game be so easy that you don't even need all of the meta progression or anything to actually make it through your first try, and then suddenly so hard that you basically have no chance. This is, of course, a problem that will fix itself as you get more used to the game and as you understand your choices better and as you upgrade various pieces of gear and unlock new equipment and all that stuff. But what it really means is the first like 5 or 6 levels of the game are going to continue to be super easy, and they're only going to get easier as you get stronger. And then you're basically gearing everything up to that last level where everything is really hard. But despite the really odd difficulty curve, it is still worth your time, and it is a very fun game. It's got very high production values because of its extremely detailed environments that are genuinely a joy to look at, and it's really fun, very highly varied combat. So I'd say it's definitely worthwhile, and if you're interested in like Metroidvanias or 2D fighters or something like that, then this will probably be up your alley because it's actually really good at that. So I'll link you in the description below this video so that you can check it out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.